December 1, 1950. Chosin Reservoir, North Korea. Temperature, -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain William Barber, of Fox Company, 7th Marines, pressed his face against the frozen ground and listened. In the darkness below, he could hear them. Hundreds of thousands of boots crunching through snow, bugles screaming across the frozen hills, voices shouting in Mandarin. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had come in the night, and they had come for everything. Barber had 246 men. Intelligence reports, the ones that had filtered through before communications collapsed, suggested he was facing somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 enemy soldiers, closing in from 3 directions. The temperature was dropping so fast that morphine syringes had to be kept in mouths to prevent freezing. Rifle bolts had to be manually cycled because the oil had turned to paste. Men urinated on their weapons to keep them functioning. What the Chinese commanders circling those frozen hills could not have imagined was that they were about to spend 5 days trying to destroy 246 Americans, and they were going to fail. This is the story of the Chosin Reservoir. 17 days in hell that produced some of the greatest acts of courage in American military history. A battle where 15,000 United States Marines and soldiers, surrounded by 120,000 Chinese troops in the most brutal cold of the Korean winter, refused to die. Where men who should have been annihilated instead fought their way out, carrying their dead, protecting their wounded, and inflicting casualties so devastating that entire Chinese divisions ceased to exist as fighting forces. The Chinese called it their greatest victory. The Marines called it a movement to the rear. History calls it the moment American fighting spirit proved it could not be extinguished by any force on earth. To understand what happened at Chosin, you have to understand what the men walking into that frozen trap believed they were marching toward. It was late November 1950, and the war was supposed to be over. General Douglas MacArthur had promised the troops would be home by Christmas. American and South Korean forces had driven the North Korean army to the brink of total collapse, pushing them almost to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. The mood at headquarters was triumphant. Maps showed nothing but open ground between the advancing UN forces and total victory. What those maps didn't show was what American aerial reconnaissance had failed to detect. 18 Chinese divisions, approximately 120,000 combat veterans of the Chinese Civil War, had crossed the Yalu River in secret, moving only at night, hiding under trees and in caves during daylight hours, wrapped in white camouflage that made them invisible against the snow. They had marched hundreds of miles, carrying their weapons, living on handfuls of rice, guided by compasses and discipline that Western military observers would later describe as extraordinary. General Song Shi-Lun, commanding the Chinese 9th Army Group, had been given a specific mission by Mao Zedong himself: destroy the 1st Marine Division, annihilate them completely, capture their general, deliver a defeat so total and humiliating that America would lose its will to fight in Korea. Song had studied his enemy. He knew the Marines were strung out along a single road from the port of Hungnam to the reservoir, 78 miles of frozen mountain highway with no alternative routes. He knew American forces depended on air support and supply lines that the Korean winter would cripple. He knew his men outnumbered the Americans 8-1. He had chosen November 27th for his attack, a night when temperatures would drop to -40, when American technology would freeze and American bodies would fail. What General Song did not know, what no Chinese commander had yet learned about American Marines, was that the cold that was supposed to kill them was the same cold that would forge them into something his military calculations had never accounted for. The night of November 27, 1950, began quietly. Marines at their positions around the reservoir noted the temperature dropping, the wind picking up, the strange silence that had settled over the surrounding hills. Veterans who had fought on Pacific Islands, men who knew combat sounds, noticed the absence of animal noise. No birds, no wind movement in the trees, just silence and cold, so deep it burned the lungs. Then, at precisely 10 p.m., the bugles started. Every Marine survivor interviewed in the decades since has described the same moment the same way. The sound came from everywhere at once, from the hills to the north, the ridges to the east, the valleys to the west. Hundreds of bugles screaming simultaneously, a sound designed by Chinese military doctrine, specifically to create panic, to disorient defenders, to announce that death was coming from every direction. It worked on some armies. It did not work on Marines. At Udamni, on the western side of the reservoir, 2 full Marine regiments, the 5th and 7th Marines, found themselves surrounded by 4 Chinese divisions. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, commanding the 1st Battalion 7th Marines, watched his perimeter light up with muzzle flashes from 3 directions simultaneously. His men were outnumbered by ratios that military doctrine considered unsurvivable. Davis did not retreat. He attacked. His reasoning was simple and brutally Marine. The Chinese expected panic. They had trained for it, planned for it, built their entire tactical approach around the assumption that surrounded Americans would collapse inward, bunch together, become easier to destroy. Davis gave them the opposite. He pushed his men outward, into the fire, forcing the Chinese to fight Americans who were moving toward them, instead of away. The first night's fighting was unlike anything either side had experienced. In temperatures that caused unprotected skin to freeze in minutes, men fought hand-to-hand when weapons jammed. Marines used rifle butts, entrenching tools, bare fists. Chinese soldiers who had trained in the relatively mild temperatures of southern China were discovering that their quilted uniforms, adequate for normal cold, were catastrophically insufficient for what the Korean mountains were delivering that night. By dawn on November 28th, the butcher's bill was staggering. The Marines had held, but at enormous cost, and the Chinese were still there, in numbers that seemed to grow rather than diminish. Reinforcements moved down from the north, fresh divisions replacing shattered ones. General Song looked at his casualty reports and recalculated. He had expected the Marines to break on the first night. They had not broken. He ordered his commanders to attack again the following night with greater force. What he was learning, too slowly and at too great a cost, was something American Marines had understood since the Pacific Campaign. There is no number of enemies that will make a Marine stop fighting as long as he has a weapon and a man beside him. The situation at Fox Hill illustrated this truth with brutal clarity. Fox Company had been assigned to hold Toktong Pass, a critical choke point, on the only road connecting the Marines at Udamni with their supply base at Hagaruri. If the Chinese took Toktong Pass, the Marines to the north were cut off completely. Captain Barber understood this. His 246 men understood this. They dug in on the frozen hillside and prepared to hold. On the first night, the Chinese sent a full battalion against Fox Hill. Approximately 800 soldiers against 246 Marines. By morning, the Chinese had not taken the hill. They had lost over 300 men. Barber had lost 20 killed and 54 wounded. He reorganized his shrinking perimeter, redistributed ammunition from the dead, and sent a radio message to regiment. Fox Company, still in position. Will hold. The second night, the Chinese sent more men. The third night, more still. Each morning, Captain Barber sent the same message. Fox Company, still in position. Will hold. By the fifth day, Barber himself had been wounded in the leg by enemy fire. He refused evacuation. He commanded his company from a stretcher, dragged from position to position by his radio man, directing fire, maintaining the discipline that was keeping his men alive. Of his original 246 Marines, 26 had been killed and 89 wounded. Every officer in the company except Barber was dead or incapacitated. Sergeants were commanding platoons. Corporals were leading squads. Fox Hill did not fall. Meanwhile, at the Marine Command Post in Hagaru-ri, Brigadier General Edward Craig and Major General Oliver Smith were making decisions that would define the battle. Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had been skeptical of the rapid advance from the beginning. Unlike MacArthur's headquarters, which had dismissed Chinese intervention warnings, Smith had spent weeks quietly preparing for exactly the situation now unfolding. He had insisted on building an airstrip at Hagaru-ri, despite orders to keep moving north. He had stockpiled supplies at every position. He had refused to string his division out faster than it could protect itself. That airstrip at Hagaru-ri would save thousands of lives. Beginning on December 1st, Air Force and Marine C-47 transport aircraft began landing on the frozen, partially completed runway under fire, evacuating the most seriously wounded and delivering critical supplies. Over 4,300 wounded Marines were flown out before the breakout began. Each flight landed and departed under Chinese mortar fire. Pilots who had been told the strip was too short, too rough, too dangerous, landed anyway, because Marines were waiting. The air support over Chosin was itself a story of extraordinary courage. Marine Corsair pilots flew close air support missions in conditions that grounded most aircraft worldwide, in temperatures that caused hydraulic systems to fail and engines to struggle. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily, dropping napalm on Chinese positions, sometimes within 50 yards of Marine lines. The margin for error in those mountains, with peaks rising thousands of feet and weather that changed in minutes, was essentially zero. First Lieutenant Thomas Hudner made a decision on December 4th that would earn him the Medal of Honor. His wingman, Ensign Jesse Brown, the first African-American naval aviator, had been shot down behind Chinese lines. Brown survived the crash, but was trapped in his cockpit, the wreckage pinning his leg. Hudner did not fly back to the carrier. He deliberately crash-landed his own Corsair next to Brown's aircraft in enemy territory in -30 temperatures to try to save him. He worked for 45 minutes in the freezing wind, trying to free Brown before a rescue helicopter arrived. Brown could not be saved, but Hudner's action, a white officer deliberately destroying his own aircraft to try to save a black pilot's life, spoke to something about these men that went beyond the battle, beyond the cold, beyond the war. On December 1st, General Smith issued the order for the breakout. The Marines at Udam-ni would fight their way south to Hagaru-ri, link up with forces there, and then the entire division would fight its way to the coast at Hungnam, 78 miles through mountains held by Chinese forces that still outnumbered them massively. Smith's famous quote to a reporter who asked about the retreat became one of the most celebrated statements in Marine Corps history. Retreat, hell. We're not retreating. We're just attacking in a different direction. The breakout from Udam-ni began on the night of December 1st. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis volunteered for the most dangerous assignment. He would take his battalion cross-country through the mountains in darkness, in -35 temperatures, through Chinese-held terrain, to relieve Fox Company at Toktong Pass and reopen the road. What Davis and his men did over the next 14 hours defies easy description. They moved through mountains with no trail, no road, no guide except compass bearings and the sound of Fox Company's guns in the distance. In temperatures so cold that men who stopped moving for more than a few minutes began to freeze. They climbed ridges and crossed valleys, fighting through Chinese positions in the darkness, losing men to cold and enemy fire, but never stopping. At dawn, on December 2nd, the remnants of Fox Company on their frozen hilltop heard something they had stopped allowing themselves to hope for. American voices, Marine voices. Davis's battalion came over the ridge, ragged, frost-bitten, having lost dozens of men in the night march. But there, Captain Barber, on his stretcher, reportedly said nothing for a long moment. Then he told his radio man to send the message. Fox Company is relieved. Davis received the Medal of Honor for that night march. So did Captain Barber. So did 7 other Marines and soldiers from the Chosin campaign. It remains one of the highest concentrations of Medal of Honor awards in any single battle in American history. The column that moved south from Udamni and Hagaruri on December 6th was unlike any formation in the history of the Marine Corps. 13,000 men, most suffering from frostbite, many wounded, all exhausted beyond the limits of normal human endurance, moving down a single road through mountains, held by an enemy that still outnumbered them. They carried their dead on the hoods of vehicles, rather than leave them behind. They dragged their wounded on improvised sleds. They fought through Chinese roadblocks at Toktong Pass, in temperatures that had dropped to -40. The Marines who fought their way through Toktong Pass did so against Chinese defenders who had spent days preparing positions, who had the high ground, who had the advantage of men who were not already at the edge of physical collapse. None of it was enough. Marine rifle companies assaulted directly up frozen slopes under fire because there was no other way through, and because stopping meant dying, and because every man in that column understood that the man beside him was depending on him to keep moving. At the bridge at Toktong Pass, Chinese engineers had removed a critical section. The gorge was 1,500 feet deep. The column could not pass. Marine engineers working with Air Force transport aircraft devised a solution that remains one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the Korean War. 8 sections of a treadway bridge, each weighing 2,500 pounds, were airdropped to the site. Working under fire in temperatures that made metal brittle and fingers useless, Marine engineers installed the bridge sections and had the column moving within hours. The column reached the coast at Hungnam on December 11, 1950. Every man who could walk walked off those mountains under his own power. Every piece of equipment that could be moved was moved. Every dead Marine came home. The numbers from the Chosin Reservoir tell a story that Chinese military historians are still struggling to reconcile with their official accounts. The 1st Marine Division and attached Army and British Royal Marine units suffered approximately 4,500 battle casualties and 7,500 non-battle casualties, primarily frostbite. It was devastating. It was also survivable, and it was inflicted by an enemy force 8 times their size in conditions that should have made resistance impossible. The Chinese 9th Army Group, which had been given the mission of annihilating the 1st Marine Division, suffered between 37,500 and 60,000 casualties, depending on the source. 7 of their divisions were so badly damaged, they were removed from combat operations for months. 3 divisions required complete reconstruction. General Song Shi-Lun, who had promised Mao the destruction of the Marines, reported his casualties to Beijing and was never again given an independent field command. Mao Zedong had sent 120,000 soldiers to destroy 15,000 Marines. The Marines had come out the other side. The Chinese had not. In the years after the war, survivors of the Chosin Reservoir became known by a name that carried both the weight of what they had survived and the pride of how they had survived it: the Chosin Few. They held reunions for decades. Men who had shared something that most humans cannot imagine, who had been cold enough to die and had refused, who had been surrounded and had fought forward, who had carried their dead home because leaving them was simply not something Marines did. General Oliver Smith, the quiet, methodical commander who had insisted on building that airstrip, who had refused to advance faster than his men could protect themselves, who had prepared for the disaster that MacArthur's headquarters had promised could not happen, was asked years later what he thought of his Marines at Chosin. He said, "I never had any doubt about them. My only concern was whether I was worthy of them." The battle at Chosin Reservoir did not end the Korean War. It did not liberate Korea. It did not achieve the dramatic strategic victories that fill history books. What it achieved was something rarer and in many ways more significant. It proved that the American fighting man, pushed beyond every limit, surrounded by enemies, abandoned by weather and geography and the failures of intelligence and command, would not break. Chinese commanders who had studied American forces in the Pacific, who had read reports of American soldiers surrendering in the Philippines, who had watched newsreel footage of American civilian comfort and assumed it translated into military softness, learned at Chosin that they had misread everything that mattered. The cold that was supposed to kill the Marines had instead stripped away everything unessential and revealed what was underneath. Men who would not leave their dead, officers who would not leave their wounded, companies that would hold impossible positions because the man next to them needed them to hold. When the last Marine walked off the mountains at Hungnam, he walked past Chinese observers who had spent 17 days trying to stop him. They had failed. He had not. The Chosin Few came home to a country that barely knew the war was happening, to newspapers focused on European politics and domestic prosperity, to a conflict already being called the Forgotten War. They received no parades. Many received no recognition at all for decades. But in the mountains above the Chosin Reservoir, in temperatures that turned the world to ice, 15,000 Americans had faced annihilation and had answered with something that no military calculation could account for, and no enemy force had ever been able to extinguish. They had answered with the particular stubborn, furious refusal to quit that has defined American soldiers since the first winter at Valley Forge. The cold remembered, the mountains remembered, and the men who were there, the Chosin Few, carried those 17 days inside them for the rest of their lives, knowing what they had done and what it had cost and why it had mattered. The Chinese came with 120,000 men to destroy them. They failed. The Marines walked out. That is the story of Chosin. That is what American Marines are made of.